So I recently watched this video from Wired about the housing crisis. It's a pretty good video, I recommend you watch it. It's mostly good information, but I have found two fragments that I disagree with. So I'm gonna play you those fragments right now.
I Love B43 asks, why are houses so expensive? Houses are really expensive right now. Number one, it's a supply and demand issue. The US is short about 4 million homes to meet the current demand. And a scarcity of any commodity means the price goes up, up, up. Rosie Dell says, what are the policies that would bring down housing prices? What policies would help renters to have enough access to affordable housing? So when we're talking about housing prices, we're really talking about increasing supply. That is what is going to bring house prices down.
So I did a little research. Let's have a look at the US population from 2000 to 2024. It went from around 282 million to around 341 million today. Okay, now let's look at housing inventory, so the number of houses in the US. So in the 2000, it was 116 million homes, and at the end of 2023 it was 145 million homes. So I put all of the data here. So from 2000 to 2024 there was a 21% increase of people and 25% increase of housing. So actually the housing construction was bigger than the increase of the population. Now in the same period we can have a look at the average house price. So in the 2000 it was $131,000, and at the end of 2023 it was almost $400,000. So the house prices have increased 306%. And as far as I can tell, we've been talking about the housing prices since fairly recently. So around 2020 was like this breaking point where like the housing crisis was imminent. I also wanted to know what's the full capacity of people that can be housed by the housing stock. So I took the number of houses from the 2000, 116 million, and I multiplied it by the average number of people per household. That gave me 301 million people who could be housed in the year 2000. Now I did the same for 2024. The number of houses is 145 million. And again, I multiplied it by 2.6, and that gave me 377 million people who can be housed today. So still we have a large number of excess homes. But as this data shows, it's not a problem of the supply. So what is it? I'm going to read some fragments of a fairly new book. It came out last month, called Against Landlords, How to Solve the Housing Crisis by Nick Baino. I recommend you read this book if you're interested in understanding the housing crisis. This book mainly focuses on the situation in the UK, however, it can be extrapolated to many other places as well. The book is also mostly focused on the rental sector, but as it argues, the rental sector and the prices of rent are an inseparable component of the total house prices. The undersupply rhetoric is also weakened by the census data showing under-occupation levels. In 2021, about 70% of housing in England and Wales was under-occupied, whereas less than 5% was overcrowded. And yet we are constantly told that Britain does not build enough homes. Despite the persistent and boisterous chorus of supply guys, commentators and ostensible affordability campaigners, many of whom are aligned with the homebuilding industry and are primarily interested in the regulation of planning law, the government's own analysis has shown that its house building targets would have had a relatively small effect on housing costs, even if they had been achieved. The build more housing argument has always seemed obviously flimsy. Its strange logic is that speculative developers would build homes in order to devalue them, that they would somehow act against their own interest by producing enough surplus housing to bring down the average price. This would be surprisingly philanthropic behavior, building far more homes than people need just to try to bring housing costs down, especially when we know, because of the situation that prevailed until the 1980s, that we can instead control those costs through law, regulations and policy reform, would be simply delinquent, boosting climate change for no good purpose. The author then goes on to explain the law in Britain that basically after the Second World War froze the rent prices at 1939 levels. This lasted until 1957, when the Conservative government decided to relax those laws. Tenants had more options. It was far more difficult for landlords to realize the higher rents. Throughout the 1950s, for example, privately rented housing tended to be cheaper than council rents, and much of it catered to the very bottom of the market. When council housing was more readily available, many landlords were unable to compete with the new purpose-built council homes, many of which had good quality design and modern amenities. and instead had to cater for tenants who could not afford a council home or were unlikely to be allocated one. But today's tenants have nowhere else to turn, and this is reflected in the extravagant prices we see in the private sector. Some landlords, most notoriously West London's Peter Ratchman, resorted to violence and intimidation through acts of physical hostility. Such landlords increased their profits by forcing sitting tenants to either sign up for new decontrolled tenancy agreements or to leave and make way for someone else. Ratchman's methods including sending thugs to intimidate tenants, sprinkling itching powder on beds and toilet seats, leaving dead rats in properties, removing doors, and in one case even removing the roof. The legal circumstances also required him to create complex webs of companies that made it so difficult to police breaches of housing conditions. For example, stinking drains, that tenants in rent control accommodations would leave in disgust before any action could be taken. But today's tenants lack the security and rent controls of the 1950s and the 1960s, and there is no longer any need to resort to violence to raise their rent. The modern landlord's absolute legal right to make someone homeless, rather than the threat that they might do so unlawfully, is sufficient to persuade today's tenants to agree to the landlord's price. The absolute right to evict, the state's guarantee that landlords can take possession very quickly, put landlords in an overwhelmingly powerful bargaining position. Housing insecurity produces a silent compulsion enforcing rental discipline. As many of us know from experience, most landlords will simply give tenants a new agreement to sign or simply announce that the rent is going up. These take it or leave it offers are backed up by a tacit understanding that eviction might easily follow right away if a new rent is not agreed, and then paid like clockwork. Tenants who wish to stay in their homes are left with no choice but to accept these increases or to find somewhere else to live, without the landlord needing to take any active steps towards evicting them. With this extraordinary legal tool at their disposal, landlords have made regular and sharp rent increases seem like a self-evident law of nature. So as you can see, the current housing crisis that we're experiencing is not at all a result of undersupply of housing or something like this. It's a direct result of how greedy and entitled the landlord class is and how much the governments over the last decades have supported them. The argument that we need to build more housing is a simple way to shut down all the initiative counteracting the predatory practices of landlords and the conservative governments. So to end the housing crisis, we don't have to build more houses. We need to put pressure on our governments to finally reintroduce the laws that were abandoned in 1980s, 1960s, 1950s that limited the extent to which landlords could yield profits from doing absolutely nothing. So if you're experiencing the consequences of the housing crisis, don't turn your heads to developers because you know they ain't gonna do anything to help you. You need to turn your heads towards your government and hopefully vote in someone that can put an end to this. Just a handful of simple regulations such as rent control or limiting the number of properties for companies and individuals is all it takes to end the atrocious housing crisis that we're dealing with today. So this is the video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you for hanging out, and I will see you in the next one. Bye bye.